From there, I was like, oh, okay, we need essences. All right, okay, I better look at Plato. I better look at the phenomenologists again and take them seriously. The ground of being isn't somewhere else. It's not this metaphysical realm that you have to try to tap into. It's here right now. It's in this conversation. It's everything everywhere all at once. When my daughter comes and gives me a hug and tells me she loves me, there's a physiological reaction, but I can't accept that's just all it is because it feels like much more.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anagage podcast. Just before we start, just some very light housekeeping. So I have a lot of stuff coming up that I'm going to share about my own work. I had a talk on philosophy of psychedelics, which I'm going to share soon. And also I have an ebook format of all my work on technology and in AI that I'll share soon as well. So if that sounds interesting to you, feel free to subscribe to my newsletter, which I'll link down below. And today I have a guest that I'm very excited to have a chat with. His name is Danny Forde, and he has this nice little book called Phenomenology of Psychedelic Experiences. It's wonderful. It's very nicely written. The thesis is quite nice. It was very, very enjoyable. It is unfortunately a bit pricey. So for those that are kind of outside of academia, maybe it's kind of like a hard ask. But at least hopefully, this episode kind of piques your curiosity, and then you can try to find other ways if this isn't affordable to you. Maybe watch other podcasts, maybe try to look some of the papers he has written, so on and so forth. So, Danny, thank you so much for accepting to coming on the show, and I'm really excited to talk with you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, ask your local library to order a copy. That's my best advice. I think there's a paperback coming out. It's like a year after, so it'll be like middle of July, but I don't know for sure yet. Which should be a little bit cheaper, but still, yeah. If it's outside of your pay range, then yeah, get your library to order it. Keep the libraries going.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's good advice. I didn't even think of that. I'm just used to just adding another one to my endless collection. But yeah, so before we get started, maybe to be helpful for people that don't know you at all, maybe just give like a 2-minute introduction about who you are and just a little bit on what you work on.
Yeah, so I live in North Cork in Ireland. I did my PhD I finished it in 2023 on the Phenomenology of Psychedelic Experiences. Been based in UCC as an assistant lecturer in the religion department since 2001, and I've been teaching the philosophy department as well on and off since 2019, I guess. Yeah, I didn't go into academia till I was like 31. I guess I spent I guess the original proper research, if you want to use that word, for the book was done in like my early 20s. As I say in the book, in Vondelpark, I had my first experience in 2001. And just, yeah, psychedelics are just such a weird, interesting, and insightful event, I guess is probably the correct word. Well, I couldn't, translate it. So I tried to be an artist, but I failed miserably, as most of them do. I've ended up in academia just out of interest. Like I was always interested in. I remember reading Plato when I was like 15. I didn't understand it, but I read it. And then, once I hit that, I think Plato said that, didn't he? It's like, don't do philosophy till you're like in your 30s or 50s, I think it was. So unintentionally, I did the Platonic procedure correctly, I guess, and ended up doing a BA, and then I went straight into my PhD. I've been teaching religion and phenomenology pretty much since then. And yeah, I persevere. I have a few papers on the go at the moment. The book came out last year. I'm hoping to get a few papers out this year. What else? I'm training to be a psychotherapist now as well, just to add that into the mix, just because why not?
Right. Yeah, amazing. And I do think Plato's recommendation was like around your 30s. So you nailed it. You nailed it pretty well.
Completely unintentional on my part.
Of course, intentional. But yeah, I'm very curious about like what drew you to philosophy in the first place, and also kind of like this decision that you had getting into academia a little bit, later in life than average. Like, what was your life experience like, and kind of what made you, follow this path?
It's all a series of accidents, really. It's all unintentional. Um, up to a, up to a certain point. What got me? I don't like. Yeah. Well, curiosity, wonder. Like, that's what Aristotle said, right? It's the fuel for philosophy. So I guess retrospectively, maybe psychedelics helped me sort of hold on to a larger sense of wonder than you normally possess, because you're supposed to go through the stages of, like, childhood, and you're filled with wonder, and then teenagehood you start sort of calcifying in your friend groups and you put yourself in boxes. Then in your 20s you're supposed to go into the world and reduce your the scope of your interests even further, to say, well, look, I'm an engineer, or I'm a professor. Well, you're not a professor in your 20s, but I'm a lawyer or whatever. And I guess, yeah, psychedelics helped me to sort of hold on to that larger sense of mystery that, is there when you stop and think about things. When you don't, like, because you can't be in that sense of wonder all the time either, but it's easier to hold on to it. Actually, I'm finding out, because I've got 5 kids, so I find them a good source of wonder as well, because they have so many questions. And just their existence is so peculiar as well. Like, you look at them sometimes and go, what's happening? So it is, yeah, it's similar to having a psychedelic experience. They're both transformative experiences, but yeah, how did I get into philosophy? Like, yeah, I ended up doing the BA just purely accidentally as well, just because I didn't know what else to do. And I thought, well, I'm interested in philosophy, so I'll study this. Then it turned out I was pretty good at it because I was interested, so that makes everything much easier if you like what you do. Yeah, and like PhD, that was accidental as well. Well, me doing it, obviously it wasn't written accidentally. But yeah, just I had a really good supervisor who encouraged me a lot, and I just kept sort of plugging away, and there was something in it, and I just the sense of wonder just sort of guided me on, and now here I am talking to you.
Amazing, cool. And in your book, you mentioned like a particular, psychedelic experience. Was that your first experience, or it's just like kind of like the most meaningful to you that you kind of decided to kind of anchor your description on?
No, that was the very first one. That was oh yeah, I'm getting old now. It was, I think, yeah, this year is like the 25-year anniversary of that. So it was a while ago. Yeah, that was first time in Vondelpark. I think I just finished high school, and I went there with my friend, and we had some Copelandia. And yeah, we sat by the lake and had a really mind blowing experience. So I was thinking about it lately. I can't remember if I'd read The Doors of Perception before or after that experience. But I'll never remember fully whether it was before or after, because I want to know whether it influenced the experience or not. But yeah, I just remember walking there. I remember I bought, was it The Great White Shark Hunt by Hunter S. Thompson in a bookshop on the way there. And I remember just trying to read the book while sitting there tripping on mushrooms. And then it just became impossible to read. And then I'm just looking at the lake and the fish and the trees and just being filled with a sense of wonder. It wasn't the most meaningful, but it was the first. And it sort of showed me that there was something to these experiences, because I never treated them like frivolously. Like, I never did them just for fun. It was always a sense of exploration.
And in relationship to, how psychedelics kind of intersect with academia, like something that I've felt a little bit on my sides is that it's something that always takes people a little bit unexpectedly. Like when you mentioned that you're doing work on kind of philosophy and psychedelics, people usually don't put those two things together. A lot of reasons for that, but I think one of the main parts is that philosophy is perceived as, at least at least in some circles, depending a little bit on the context, but it's often thought of it as something very serious, like something very academic. And psychedelics is just like this weird thing that some hippies do or whatever, right? So they're like the overlap is very minimal in a lot of people's minds. And also, you feel this a little bit as well when talking with other people that are into philosophy. They're like, it's like psychedelics, like whatever, a lot of times people don't take it uh, very seriously, at least in the beginning, especially if they never thought about it very much. So I'm just curious what your experience in academia is like, and then also when you encounter people that maybe are a bit skeptical about the philosophical relevance of psychedelics, uh, without like doing a full exposition of your thesis yet, but just like in a few sound bites, like what do you think is like a good argument on why philosophy should take studying these things a bit more carefully and seriously?
All right. So there's a couple of things there. So the normal reaction, I've always just got positive reactions. People are genuinely or generally interested. Well, I think it's changed a lot in like the last 10 years, maybe. Because I remember like when I was starting out, it was the only other guy I found was Peter Shosted Hughes, based in Exeter, who I think you interviewed him before, right? But yeah, there wasn't many. Like if I searched anything for philosophy of psychedelics, there was like Aldous Huxley. It is really well written. It's beautiful. It's a fantastic book, but it's not proper philosophy. And there was Peter. I can't remember if there was any. I think Chris Leatherby was starting to put out a couple of papers as well around that time. But there was some interview with Peter. He was just like, if you tell people you're working on philosophy of psychedelics, it's almost like, it's like you were saying a dirty word. People are like, "Why you don't want a career in philosophy?" Obviously, then if you're focusing on psychedelics, which I mean, yeah, you talk about careers in philosophy, regardless of psychedelics anyway, as being gold dust or Ponzi scheme. But that's besides the point. But yeah, I think it's changed a lot now. I think now most people, because there has been so much on it. I think Michael Pollan's book as well sort of changed or opened up at least conversations in the more general, not just in academia, but just in the general population anyway. And why should philosophers be interested in psychedelics? Because they should be interested in everything. There's philosophy of absolutely everything: philosophy of AI, philosophy of biology, philosophy of, you know, these people write papers on, water resources in Arizona or, yeah, everything. So why not this experience that people have that they find very meaningful and that does seem to have genuine psychotherapeutic benefits for a lot of people. So I would seem very small-minded to exclude psychedelics just because it's something that some hippies did, 50 years ago, or probably more than that now. Yeah, more than that now.
Yeah, I agree that that's a really good way to frame it, and I absolutely love how you highlighted that. Philosophy should be interested in everything. That's something that I take very close to heart as well. Now, one of the things that you kind of start the book with very early on, which I really like as well, is like the whole notion of naturalism. And you kind of like advocate, or at least you kind of give some credence to this notion of true naturalism, coined by some other philosopher. I kind of forgot his name now, but the biggest takeaway being that it's kind of like avoiding this pitfall of both necessarily going into the supernatural, at least like a little bit too casually, but also on the other hand, trying to avoid being reductionist, which is also the camp that I try to follow, and that I feel very lonely in. That's why I liked your book so much as well. So yeah, I'm really interested to see if you could explain maybe a little bit to the audience, kind of like what that stance is, just unpack it a little bit, and then why do you think that's so relevant and needed for the kind of thesis that you advocate, and when you're thinking about, philosophy of psychedelics more broadly?
Oof, okay, big question. Naturalism is one of those words that has to be very carefully defined anytime you use it. Usually it's used, well, I'll use it here in the sense of the idea that the natural sciences have an explanatory monopoly on everything. So eventually, once it's finished and we understand everything, then physics will be able to explain everything in the cosmos, including consciousness and subjective experience. Which, I mean, like, yeah, I guess in my 20s, even, yeah, before I started doing philosophy, I would have been firmly in the sort of like atheist, naturalist camp where I would have thought, well, science will explain everything. Religion is nonsense. It's just, parlor games and fancy tricks and people with beliefs because they don't know what they're talking about. But if everyone studied science, then the world would be a better place. And then I started doing philosophy, phenomenology in particular. It was when I did phenomenology in my undergrad, it was, what sort of kicked open the doors for me, I guess, was Husserl's idea of anti-psychologism in these logical investigations, which he just sort of um, I'll use the word, he poo-poos the idea that the laws of logic can be explained by psychology, because the laws of logic have to be a priori, eternal, and not dependent upon what I think or what you think. They exist ideally in the sense of they exist as an idea which is not mind dependent. So they exist, in the cosmos, and we intuit them and we get in touch with them. Yeah, so I'm teaching first years. It's the question that always gets the biggest reactions. I ask them if math was something that was invented or something that was discovered, and people get their backs up about that one. They're either firmly in one camp or another. And the people who, yeah, a lot of people who haven't thought about it. Yeah, I'll stay with that. A lot of people who haven't thought about it yet think that they say no, obviously it's invented. It's something we made up. It doesn't exist. And I go, well, how does it not exist? Like if we all die, and then a slime mold on planet Jupiter evolves into something that can do math in a few years, they'll do Pythagoras, or they'll figure out the Pythagorean theorem, because those things are eternally valid and true. They won't say the words Pythagorean theorem because Pythagoras, will be dead. They'll use a different way of communicating, but that thing that they're intuiting or that they're intentionally corresponding with will still exist. So it's not dependent upon us. Now, for me, I was like, okay, all right. So science doesn't have an explanatory monopoly. If you want to do science, then you need logic, and if you're using logic and the laws of math, then you have to be using these non-scientific, non-mathematical, or sorry, yeah, non-scientific, non-naturalistic objects in order to do your work. Yeah, and from there I was like, oh, okay, we need essences. All right, okay, I better look at Plato. I better look at the phenomenologists again and take them seriously.
Yeah, that's a pretty good start. That's a good explainer. Now, one thing that I often think about in relationship to this naturalist position is that I think the argument that you just proposed, specifically anchored in logic and mathematics, I think it's very strong, and also it's very common, and I think that really puts to rest like this very hard reductionist, like naturalist position. Now, what I wonder though is that when we take that type of approach, I think that's really good as an initial framing to just like, okay, if you have this type of worldview that's like hyper entrenched in this kind of like scientism, then that kind of allows you to pick out of that. But I think a lot of the people that try to advocate for this position, actually, the laws of logic and mathematics is actually of relatively low concern to them. I think when people try to articulate this type of position, it's usually more in reference to meaning itself. And so I'm just curious about how you then make this extra bridge from kind of like these, kind of Platonic essence realities of logic and mathematics to meaning that we all care about, because your student might say, okay, sure, they might discover, the laws of mathematics, which, sure, okay, they exist outside of human subjectivity, but then everything else that we might care about, like love and beauty, that's just like very specific instantiations of the human brain and the values that have evolved over time and whatnot. So it's like, how exactly do you close that gap?
Yeah, love is a good one. I like to bring that one up with students as well. Like, because it forces them to think, like, especially if they're in relationships, it's just like when your partner tells you that they love you, are you, are they just expressing some, neurobiological, physiological happenings, and, just they're making noises with their mouth. So you have some sort of, socially based or socially reinforced physiological reaction. It's like, is that all it is? Like, because I also tell students that I never tell anybody what they're supposed to think or what's true. I just want them to sort of start thinking about things for themselves. But yeah, try to frame it like that. Like when you tell your mom you love her, or your dad or your kid, it was like, are you just expressing this is years of, millennia of evolution telling me to carry on the species? That's all that's happening here. It's like, it doesn't seem like that to me. Like when my daughter comes and gives me a hug and tells me she loves me, it's like there's a physiological reaction, but like, I don't know, I can't accept that that's just all it is, because it feels like much more. And parents do a lot to we do things that's against, that would contradict our millennia of evolution to, sustain ourselves in order to keep our kids healthy and happy and alive and continuing, not just to continue the species, but just to, yeah, all right, yeah, I don't want to jump ahead to talk about Shaler and his notion of love or the order of love, and because you're correctly orienting yourself, not just with yourself or with your family, but with the universe at large as well. If you take love to be something more than just, chemicals and electrical signals in your brain.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a perfect answer actually. I think there's a lot of directions that someone can take, and I think to me that always feels the strongest. And that's also why I was very interested in your work particular, and kind of caught my eye the very first time that I saw it, because I think the phenomenology aspect is like absolutely the most crucial to think about these things, and also to think about philosophy in general. Because like when I was quite young, and I was kind of trying to figure out what's the most logical worldview, and trying to solve all these problems. Like I think the strongest turn I ever made was to kind of like try to make no assumptions at all, kind of like a Cartesian doubt thing, but then try to place like a line in the sand of like, what is the thing that I'm not willing to compromise, regardless of whatever intellectual babblings I have on my head. And the answer that I came up with was precisely love, because again, I think people just have this intuition that you can't reduce that. And so I think based on your phenomenology, I think that's the best place to start. And then because it's the best place to start, okay, then maybe then you can kind of build around it. And I think maybe that's a fruitful approach. And I think the way that you did it in regards to the psychedelic experiences is quite fruitful. Now, speaking of phenomenology, you kind of introduced this concept of realistic phenomenology in your book. And on the surface, when you're kind of going through the process of describing it, it kind of looks almost like a contradiction, because the standard association is kind of the phenomenology is about appearances, how things kind of show up. But then this also has a Platonic element of it, which is usually like, okay, these are transcendent forms that are otherworldly. And so you follow, kind of this in between to some degree, kind of perspective, which I think is quite helpful, where you do try to claim that essences are real in the ultimate sense, but also they're not free floating things somewhere in space. So I thought that was quite helpful, and I think that's actually a position that is really important in the field, and also it's something that I struggle quite a bit as well, because I'm very influenced by Heidegger, number one, and I think that unlocked a lot for me. But also I'm very influenced by Plato as well, and in a lot of ways they kind of don't vibe very well. And one of the reasons is precisely because of this notion of essences, because Heidegger is in a phenomenological tradition, and also it's kind of a little bit in some aspects kind of this start slash continuation of lineage against kind of the relativity of perspective of the world, that there's just not like one thing that you can grasp. And again, Plato is kind of the exact opposite. So I think this is super useful to me, and I think it's super useful in general. So yeah, I think a deep dive on all these aspects of phenomenology, Platonism, and then kind of like this middle ground that you found, I think would be quite interesting.
Okay. Yeah, again, phenomenology is one of those other words that gets abused quite a lot, or misused probably is the more correct word, because there's so many different variations, and a lot of the different variations will have different or contradicting sort of metaphysical allegiances. So the phenomenology that I use is it's what's called realist phenomenology, as opposed to when most people hear phenomenology, they think of like Husserl's later work after he made the terrible mistake of reading Kant and taking him seriously around 1905 or 1907, and he had his whole idealist turn and just ruined all of his later work, in my opinion. So people think of like doing the epoche, which like I've done phenomenology for years now. I've no idea what epoche is, or how do you do it, how do you bracket everything. Like no one's been able to explain it to me correctly. Maybe it's me. It could be me. but I don't think it's just me. But yeah, so the early Husserl, like the logical investigations in particular, sort of informed a lot. Then there was the group that sort of rejected his idealist turn. So people like Max Scheler, Edith Stein, Roman Ingarden. I can't remember. There's a long list of them. So my supervisor we wrote the SEP article on the Munich-Gottingen circle. Yeah, Daubert. I can't remember the rest off the top of my head, but like, yeah, Scheler was who I was looking at mostly. Max von Hildebrand. Oh, sorry, not Max von. Dietrich von Hildebrand as well. Yeah, so that sort of school of philosophy is what. Yeah, because you're talking about Platonism. Joseph Seifert referred to it as sober Platonism, which I always thought was quite interesting. It's Platonism, but without the sort of esoteric, sort of otherworldly aspect to it. It was very much grounded in reality. So for realists, so if you're an idealist, then you think that only sort of consciousness exists. But the realist phenomenologists reject this and reject his whole idealist turn and think that no, there is a mind-independent physical world out there that we're in touch with. But there are also essences. And for people like Adolf Reinach, who unfortunately died very young in World War One, that was his whole focus of phenomenology. Phenomenology should be, it's the philosophy of essences. It's a continuation of Platonism, just, without the, anamnesis or the, this world just being a poor participant in the world of forms. When it's like, this is it, this is the world, it exists independent of you. There are essences. Love exists, beauty exists, and we can intuit what they are. Yeah, like, 'cause I didn't know where to start with philosophy either, and phenomenology was the one that, yeah, because it was sort of first with the logical investigations. Oh well, with these anti-psychologism that sort of lured me in, and then I was like, okay, well, phenomenology offers a way of like looking at this. What was the self was the first thing that I was looking at really, in relation to the psychedelic experience. It offered a way to think about the self and consciousness and how the world shows up for us in a way that didn't seem to reduce it in any way. It took it as it was, reality, sort of warts and all, I guess, without having to filter it through, biology or physics or analytic philosophy, but also without rejecting, the findings of any of those fields of study. Phenomenology seems to me like the most sort of all-encompassing approach to acquiring knowledge or understanding of the world.
Yeah, perfect. That's a really good breakdown. And somewhat connected to that, also something that I would like to get into is that at some point you also bring up the whole problem and the relevance of representationalism, and then you kind of trace it, back to Locke. And long story short, where we don't perceive the things themselves, but always kind of this representation in our mind, in our brain. And then you also see this kind of lineage also appear in like more scientific versions nowadays, like things like predictive processing, Bayesian brain hypothesis, things of that nature. And then also when you take that view, then I think also it frames the psychedelic experience in a way that's very easily explainable by, you're just making predictions and adjustments of these representations in your head. That's disrupted, therefore all this weird stuff happens, and that's all there is to it. So it's just a misfiring basically of those representations. So I'm just curious if you could kind of expand a little bit on this notion of oral representation, like why is it relevant? And then ultimately, why do you reject it and what you offer instead?
Yeah, so for representationalism, it's the idea that our perception that okay, here's my coffee cup. He's blurred. There's Gonzo. So when I'm looking at my coffee cup, I'm not really seeing my coffee cup. It's just my brain is representing it in my head. So there's light hitting the cup, goes in from my optic nerve into my brain, electrical signals happen, and there's a representation that occurs in my brain of the cup. Yeah, phenomenology, common sense, I think, should reject that point of view. One, because it implies a duplicity of objects, because there has to be the, extramental cup, the cup that exists out in the world, and then there's my internal representation of the cup. So there's a weird gap between reality and just my perception of reality. And also it would mean that we're never actually in touch with reality, because if all we perceive is representations, then we're never actually perceiving the world as such. Like, philosophy is weird, but at a certain point, it has to make sense as well. There has to be some sort of common sense basis to it as well. So yeah, so for phenomenal, and not just phenomenology, for a lot of philosophers, like, perception it's a lot richer than just what's given sensorially. So I use the idea, for example, of affordances in the book, which comes from, what's the guy's name again? Gibson? Yeah, Gibson. Which is the idea that we perceive abstract qualities of objects as well. So I think the example I use in the book is, if I'm walking down the road and an angry dog appears, I'll pick up a stick straight away. I don't have to go through the mental process of thinking there's a stick, I can defend myself with it. I immediately perceive its, throwability or hitability of the stick. Yeah, I talk about cognitive penetration as well. I argue that perception is like, I perceive like, you don't have to think about, like, when I look at cup, I understand the concept of cup, or look at laptop, I perceive all the possibilities given in that object immediately without, recourse to further thought. Yeah, then I think it was it Kripke that I defer to, because he has this differentiation between epistemic and non-epistemic seeing. So obviously, if perception is cognitively penetrated, not everything can be epistemic seeing, because then I'd have to have concepts for absolutely everything that I'm seeing at all times. So he uses the example of, like, his cocker spaniel that he talks about, his dog. Like, his dog doesn't have epistemic seeing. His dog just has, non-epistemic seeing for the most part. Maybe it does, at dinner time or whatever. It has the concept of food, possibly. But obviously, human beings have much richer epistemic palette to draw from. So what was the second part of your question? Oh, yeah, you were talking about predictive processing as well, and the idea that you can reduce it down. Yeah, once you get your ducks in a row, like, if that's going to be your approach to perception, that it is just representational, then it does offer, and you're working within a naturalistic framework, then the solution, or your explanation, I guess, for the psychedelic experience is much simpler. It's just like, well, it's just brain stuff happening, and your predictions are all misfiring, or your brain is just hyper connected. I'm always conscious when I'm doing this that, like, I sound like I'm trying to trash science, which I'm not trying to do. It's just, I think they make the mistake of their explanation has a border, and it's, red skull, and everything's in there. Was I think, well, no, realities goes beyond the skull. There's more things happening than just can be explained by whatever's going on in your brain. So, like, I'm not arguing that psychedelics don't affect neural networks or default mode networks. Was reduced. There's hyper global connectivity. Absolutely, there's physiological happenings. But like I was saying with naturalism earlier on, that physiology or biology or chemistry or physics won't explain everything.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I think that's a really good explainer. Now, in terms of this notion of perception and the notion of being in contact with reality, there's this dilemma, I suppose, that I kept coming back to in your book, which I think is kind of like a universal thing, really, and I've thought about it for a long time. But it made me think a little bit harder, kind of this past week when I was reading your book, and that's the notion of the very concept of raw perception, which you, to some degree, use that a lot, of just kind of like, you have this notion of, okay, the ego is diminished in the experience, and that allows you to get, you often make kind of these metaphors or illusions of the object itself, where it's kind of like you're getting closer to the object, and you're kind of like reducing your own self, and therefore you're in greater and greater contact with reality. And I always feel a little bit of a tension when I think about things in those terms, because to one degree, I really empathize, sorry. Because number one, there is something to the experience of psychedelics, which rings very, very true to that. And also something that I take quite seriously as well is that this notion of removing, like removing yourself towards getting more in contact with reality. This is something that has a very long, religious tradition as well. So the most straightforward one to understand is Buddhism, which kind of have attachments to the world, and that kind of like influences your level of self-deception, and therefore by taking that off, so to speak, then you get in higher contact with reality. And you see the very same thing in Christianity. The easiest to understand being orthodoxy, the notion of the passions, things like that. And so when I think about it in those terms, then that makes a lot of sense. Which is kind of like we need to shed, kind of what we bring to the experience, which then clouds kind of this pure aspect of reality. However, there's another aspect which, funny enough, is also, in my opinion, very influenced by phenomenology, which is, at the same time, there is no issue, there is no instance of pure raw perception, because perception is already an act of sense making. And so like it's built in, meaning is built in from the get-go. And you can't just walk around it. Like there's nothing behind it, because it's part of the very process, and that is already like laden with value. So like you can't possibly claim that is pure. Now you could try to like make some divisions based on kind of intersubjectivity, or like what's human versus non-human, but then you run into then all kinds of problems trying to delineate kind of these borders. And I think the example, for example, that you mentioned of these valences in the world, and these affordances. So, for example, the dog coming to you, that experience is like, you can't. The reason why that's automatic is precisely because, to some degree, your brain interprets everything in a gestalt, right? And that gestalt is based on a lot of things that are already defined. Like, for example, the fact that you're a human being. So it's like, when I grab a stick, the stick has the function of being graspable, and so on and so forth, right? But then there also has a bunch of other connotations as well, of like, how do we interpret what the dog is, what intention of the dog is, that has like, it explodes in a lot of different ways. And this is all problematic when we come back to this notion of the raw experience, let's say. So how do you personally kind of like see this type of dilemma between getting closer to reality of raw experience, and at the same time experience always being already an act of sense making, that you can't get an actual raw phenomena?
It's what I call ego-free seeing in the book. So now I talked about cognitive penetration a while ago, like what's cognitively penetrating my perception during ordinary states of consciousness is what I call the ego, or your narrative sense of self, or your autobiography, which is, it's always in the background. You're always imposing structures and limitations or possibilities or whatever it is on reality, depending on, like, I'm drinking coffee, so that's changing my consciousness now. I'm engaging in this conversation, and that's affecting my consciousness now. But all of my history and all of my narrativity and all of my past and, yeah, my physiology presently as well affects how I'm perceiving the world. So yeah, there's, as you were saying, there's a constant process of sense making going on presently. But if I was on mushrooms, for example, right now, sitting, off in the woods by myself, and my ego has been temporarily, has been sent on holiday for a little while, then the impositions that I'm putting onto my perception, that's the baggage that gets taken with the ego. So what's given to me then is just reality, just as it is, essentially, as much as possible, without me just a nice vase of flowers on the desk right here. But like, I don't think about them. Not right now, because I'm engaging in this conversation. There's things going on. But whereas on mushrooms, they might be the most striking thing in the room, because they have this sort of radiance to them. Like, Huxley's wrote about a vase of flowers in the Doors of Perception as well. I didn't really understand what he was talking about until I had a psychedelic experience, and then I looked at some flowers and went, "Oh, okay, I get it. That's like, it's just existence." 'Cause when I'm ordinarily perceiving things, or with my ego mind, I'm looking at reality, then it's much more pragmatic, because it has to be, because we have to do things. I have to go to work. I have to feed my kids. I have to, walk the dogs. I got to pay the bills, so on and so forth. But when I'm on mushrooms, well, that's relevant. This is existence. This is pure being. This is, what was Merleau-Ponty's phrase? Wild being. Is it before you impose anything upon it. I don't know. It's an interesting question of whether there's still sense making or whether it's just pure perception. My intuition would be that it's pure perception and the sense making comes after the fact. Because in the moment, you're not thinking, I am making sense of this and this is existence. And I'm looking at it as just happening. If I was prepared, it's just, I'd ring a little bell right now and just say, that's what it is. Whereas in ordinary states, it's not because, the little homunculus is there. The ego is has to be there because again, I feel like a tightrope walker sometimes. So yeah, I don't see the ego as something inherently bad either. Like, ironically, I think you need to have a good, strong ego in order to have a psychedelic experience. So you can come back and integrate things fully and learn and adjust. I don't mean ego in the pejorative sense at all. I just mean ego as in, if someone asks you who you are, you tell them your name, your story, where you came from, your likes, your dislikes, your hopes, your fears, your desires, and so on. That's all I mean by ego.
Where I get a little bit more uncertain about that type of framework is because I'm actually not sure how strong of a claim it is that you can have that type of raw perception even in the psychedelic state. Because, for example, when you mention, okay, I'm looking at the vase of flowers and it's just like pure perception, like I'm not thinking about anything except except the object itself. The issue is that this type of sense making that we have, first of all, it's not cognitive, at least cognitive, not in the lowest sense. And also the problem of why this claim is a little bit difficult, in my opinion, is because this type of sense making is actually what affords perception. And I think a lot of cognitive science, especially for cognitive science, kind of like at least hints about this a lot. So it's like it's not like it's not like this supplementary thing that you just can get rid of. Otherwise, you literally could not make sense of the vase of flowers. I think that's why I get a little bit skeptical, not in a cynical way, but just in a philosophical way of like how can this actually hold up. But in terms of this connection between perception and cognition, maybe a more fruitful way to go about it is that I feel like a lot in your work you do come back again and again these like examples of perception, and I was actually quite taken aback actually when how often you mentioned Huxley, because he's more often mentioned as kind of like a cultural influence rather than when something is a bit more academic. So I was quite surprised in a positive way actually, because I do think it's the work is quite good and worth referencing. But again, it is very much object oriented, and to me that's always a little bit weird in some sense, because from my perspective at least, a lot of what I do in my own work as well is precisely to try to make the claim a little bit that the perceptual impact of psychedelics is a little bit overrated, and I actually think that there's dimensions of the experience which are much more important. Some of them are cognitive, some of them are even way more basic, which is like your overall stance to the worlds, like very, very like basic existential frameworks of how you make sense of yourself, of others, of the world, and so on. But again, in your book, very often you come back to to this notion of the object, and to come back to Huxley's example. And again, the reason why I'm mentioning is because then this connects to this notion of our perception. It's like when when you say that you look at the vase of flowers and you're in this state of amazement, like, are you in the state of amazement because you notice kind of like this pure being in the object in front of you, or do you enter in a mindset that is rich with wonder and awe, which then that kind of impression, let's say, then colors your perception, and those are two very different things, and that drastically affects the relevance that you give when you make that kind of reports of what is actually happening when I look at this vase of flowers, and then I have this wonderful experience that seems completely different from ordinary consciousness.
Interesting. So you think it's like it's like a chicken and an egg kind of a question? Like what came first, like the sense of awe, and then you look at the flowers, or is that the flowers are just like the awe is like instantaneous or something like that?
Yeah, some degree, a little bit, and I think the reason why this matters so much is because I mean, obviously, it's biased. It's just my own take, but I think one of the ways to make philosophy of psychedelics more productive is to get away from perception. And obviously, this is just based on my own experiences, my own philosophical backgrounds that I'm bringing. But then this actually matters because then it affects where you put the relevance, and also a causal factor as well of the experience. So like, it completely changes your framing, I think.
Because I keep going back to objects in the book. I'll defend that just a little bit. As I haven't mentioned it yet. So intentionality is like the core concept in phenomenology, which is the idea that our consciousness is always directed towards or at something. It's often called offness. So there's perceptions or thoughts or moods or emotions or whatever. So intentionality is typically structured as there's a self, there's a mode, and there's the object. Well, that's what I argue that the structure of intentionality is. So, for example, I'm looking at my cup again. So I am the self undergoing this intentional act. I'm engaging in the object through the mode of perception, which is one of the primary modes of being in the world, according to people like Merleau-Ponty. And then the object is physical thing, the cup. Obviously, realist phenomenology has a very rich ontological palette where we can talk about imaginary objects, fictional objects, ideal objects, so on and so forth, physical objects as well. So I think that's why it seems like I keep coming back to objects, specifically in the chapter 3 on the intentional mode, because that chapter is specifically about perception. So there, yeah, I do talk about perceiving the external world while on psychedelics in particular. And then in the next chapter on intentional objects, that's where I start talking about, like, is it still perception? I get like I'm talking about like what happens with you, like with your eyes closed, or you're on one of the your mythopoetic sort of odysseys that happens during a psychedelic experience. Whether that is perception or intuition or whatever word you want to use, I don't know. It's not perception in the the typical sense of the term, because you're not seeing anything external to yourself. It's an interior journey. Well, I get what you're saying as well, because you're saying you think the philosophy of psychedelics is too oriented on just how we perceive the world, and not so much like you talk more about the somatic experience.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think the best way to think about it is, in my opinion, the best way to describe it is that you have you have certain existential orientations to the world, and those have, number one, they have nothing to do with perception, and also a lot of times they're not propositional in nature either. And I think that's a lot of what's happening in the psychedelic experience, and so that's why I don't like to focus as much on it. And even though I kind of like a little bit of the distinction that you made between kind of like perception of the outside world and kind of like these hallucinations in kind of like your closed eyes, um, in my view, I actually put them a little bit in the same basket actually, because the way that I see it, and again, maybe this is a little bit ironic for me to say it, because again, it comes back to these notions of brain reductionism, representationalism, and whatnot. So it's a whole can of worms. But I do think that there's a decent argument, at least from models like predictive processing, where it certainly seems clear that from a scientific perspective that your perception is built, like it's a model of the world. Now, how you make sense of that claim, then that gets very problematic, because again, there's this notion of if you're in contact with reality or not. So it's very complicated, but at least something like that definitely happens. And then that kind of world building, let's say, I think that's exactly what's happening on closed eye visuals as well. And so it's just a matter of you trying to make sense of whatever you're thinking about, but then because your imagination is so high, and because you're having all these deep like symbolic imagery, then you're perceptually building, this all these visuals that are coming up. But I still view it as the same thing, which is kind of like you're seeing things. And I think the better question and the bigger question is, how are you orienting yourself in the world, which has nothing to do, again, with outside perception or these inside visuals that you have if you have closed eyes.
All right. Yeah, no, there's definitely something to that as well. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, because it's sort of, what's the word? Yeah, I guess you're being in the world, I guess, for want of a better phrase. Not to get too Heideggerian.
We can get Heideggerian.
I don't know. I don't know. Although, yeah, that's sort of more talking about the consequences, or because yeah, you like when I did that presentation with Alessandro. You were at that the one in December online, right? We talked about the phenomenology of religious experience. I think the same thing can be, a pledge to psychedelic experiences for how meaningful they are and what they do is like they reorder your ordo amoris. So the what you love is how you are and what you are in the world. And before psychedelic experience, your order of love or your order amoris can be, a certain way, either informed by, your familial background, your culture, your society, whatever period of life that you're in. But what religious experience or a mystical experience and a psychedelic experience too will do is reorder that and put it more in tune with unobjectively aligned with, sounds more stoic, doesn't it? That you're putting yourself in order with the logos, essentially, that you're aligning your wants and desires and your love for the world with the love of the cosmos, which is just trying to help the cosmos grow towards its greatest potential, I think. Well, for an individual and for the cosmos as a whole, arguably, but let's not get too cosmological, I guess. I retract the cosmological bit. We'll focus on the individual. We'll figure that one out first, and then we can do the cosmos later. Yeah, because I think there's an element of, was he Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychotherapist? He has this concept of self-actualization, that all humans are like acorns, and given the right environment and the right treatment, it can grow into the fullest potential of an oak tree. But a lot of people, we get weathered by time and circumstance, so we don't grow to our full potential. And I think there's a similarity between Roger's idea of the self-actualizing tendency and Shaler's idea of love in the cosmos, and that is this sort of force that pushes and propels us forwards in order to attain our maximum potential. So that has to tie in with your being in the world as well during the psychedelic experience. Maybe that's your sense of the ordo amoris being realigned. Because I think, like, when people ask me about the psychedelic experience and what its benefits are, it's like the simplest way of putting it is that it shows you that you're not the stories you tell yourself about yourself. That's the most basic way of putting it. It's like you get this, it's not somebody telling you that, it's you experience that, like, oh, okay, I'm not just these things that I say that I am. There's something else going on. Yeah, I'm interested to hear more about your work as well, because you're focused on the sort of the more like existential orientation, is it?
Yeah, very much so.
I don't think they need to be mutually exclusive, though. I think they can complement each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think they're in direct like opposition, but yeah, there is a little bit of nuance then once we start getting into the weeds. But what you said now was great. That was super helpful. But I wanted to cover a little bit more of this notion of love and the logos and whatnot, because here's the thing. It's like, I think people like me, and I think people like you, as far as I'm able to tell, when we position ourselves in this kind of like enriched naturalism, it's still somewhat easy to make it compatible with a scientific worldview. But then but then when you step into that, then you kind of also open a little bit of the fields of religious languages and religious worldviews and mysticism and whatnot. and then you find that there's a lot of language and metaphor there that is really useful, and so you end up kind of incorporating it and using it. But then, you're very far away from like your initial starting point of just like trying to make the easiest case possible for like reconciliation between this type of thing and kind of a scientific worldview. And I think a really good example of this is precisely what you mentioned just now, of aligning yourself with the love of the universe, or like following the logos in kind of like a stoic sense. So I think a lot of people might kind of get lost of like like I thought that was somewhere and now I'm somewhere else, and this makes no sense whatsoever. So and this is something that even I struggle with. Like I've come up with metaphors and kind of little stories of how I can make sense of these like more mystical expressions in a way that aren't necessarily supernatural. But I'm always doubting myself because these are very complicated things, and also, even though they have a rich tradition, it's not very easy also to interpret that tradition, and then sometimes there's competing traditions. So yeah, I would just like to love your take on it, on like what exactly do you think that means, and how can you have the highest richness possible from the mystical side, but also at the same time of being compatible with like a holistic naturalism.
Jesus, you're giving me all the easy questions, eh? Uh, oh, Christ. Um, well, what I've been sort of dabbling with the idea of lately is the insufficiency of language. You can't capture infinity in any sort of sounds, and poetry will get you close. Music might get you a little bit closer, but nothing will capture the raw experience of what that is. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, Jesus, it's sort of like this is just Jackson's knowledge argument. I think, like, no matter how much we know about the world or how much we can convey, either through dialogue or through writing or through math or through art, nothing can replace the raw givenness of whatever that experience might be like. I guess the short version of the answer, because I was trying to do it for years, like, what, because I said I was trying to like do art. I was writing, and it's like writing really weird postmodern stuff that didn't make sense. Like, people read things that said they felt like they were getting stoned, which I took as a compliment. I was like, okay, I'm doing something right then, but like it still wasn't. It was just trying to evoke a feeling, I guess, rather more than tell a story. Yeah, this sort of ties back into what your point was as well. Is what psychedelics do is like they evoke a feeling. They don't just tell you a story. That maybe you make sense of it afterwards, like in the integration phase. But like while you're in the experience, then you're just experiencing, and that's all it is. So when I talked about like ringing a bell earlier on, like this, it's like, yeah, oh, Jesus, yeah. Christ, you're forcing me to draw weird conclusions now as well. It's like James Joyce with Ulysses, where he tried to capture the entirety of like one day in Dublin in a giant book, and it's obscene and crazy. And like then he goes even further then with Finnegan's Wake, which is like everything. It's all a society, all condensed. It's like here comes everybody. It's like you can't. That's why the book makes no sense. It's because you're trying to condense everything into a thing, which it can't be. Because as soon as you start using words and articulating yourselves, like no matter how beautiful your poetry might be, your words are like fences and they exclude things. Because experience is just you're open, like that's it. It's you're open to what's happening. And so psychedelics just put the ego aside, so we're even further open, or as open as you can possibly be, given the limitations of your physiology and your cognitive capacities. I think that's my answer.
Yeah, wonderful. That's great. To shift gears a little bit on something a little bit easier, but I think it's quite important as well. Something also that I really don't like about the field of philosophy of psychedelics is that it's very focused on the self, and also very often on this like pejorative kind of like, oh, it's just an illusion type thing. And I think there's a lot of value on it, but I think there's an overemphasis on that, and also I think that also gets tricky from a philosophical perspective as well. And so I was quite happy with kind of your take on the self and kind of your how you related to the literature. I thought it was quite nice. So maybe explain a little bit on what do you think the self is? How is that relevant for the psychedelic experience? And then how does that compare to other people in the fields that try to argue that the self is not a real entity in the deepest ontological sense, and they're just like kind of like this representational binding mechanism that just happens to be messed up, basically.
That's how I got started in this, or I started this whole process. That was the first thing I wrote. And yeah, parts of it were actually done in my undergrad. But yeah, so yeah, I was doing phenomenology. We were talking about, for me-ness, or that, the minimal sense of givenness of perception. And I think, it must have been around the time Chris Leatherby's first paper on the self, I can't remember what the name of it is, self-unbound or something like that, maybe. So for the neuroskeptics, which is what I refer to them in my book, they consider the self to be just something that the brain concocts just in order to make information transfer between different brain areas more expedient. So the self doesn't actually exist. Like Cartesian fiction or Cartesian illusion is what they think our idea of the self is. I remember talking with that with my supervisor, and then going home and like reading, like, was it Dan Zahavi was this first sort of stuff that I was reading on the nature of the self. And just from my own experience as well, it's like, well, that doesn't exactly ring true. It makes sense if you're, just basing your explanation in the field of scientific naturalism. But like, there's still a minimal sense of for meanness there. Like I'm experiencing, and who's having that experience, or what's having that experience? Well, it has to be like the self, not the self in its largest sense, but in the minimal self. So I didn't invent it. I just sort of rephrased it that there's this. I have a tripartite part of the self. So there's like the superordinate sense of self, which is the totality, your bio psycho physiological self, incorporating your body, your mind, everything. Subordinate to that, there's the ego, which I mentioned already, is your narrative sense of identity. And then going even further down, there's bare for me-ness, which is just first personal pre-reflective givenness of experience. And I argue that while the ego can dissolve during psychedelic experiences, the minimal self does not. And obviously, your physiological self, like your body, doesn't dissolve. It's just your ego dissolves. So that sense of self is maintained through the minimal forminess, which is like, it's a primitive notion, but it's there and it's enough. And I can't remember the paper. There are some papers who, I think it's maybe Raphael Milliere in one of his papers, because he adopts a similar approach to Chris Leatherby, that like self is this Cartesian fiction, but this minimal self does persist. I'm just like, well, what's that then? Like, that has to be something. People are having these experiences, and then they're coming back afterwards and they say, oh, I experienced this, that, and this, and this. And they go, well, how do you know that if there was no self there? It can't just be this sort of fiction. Like, how are you, like, the way they use the word self is very particular, just because it's something that can't be quantified by science, I guess. So it doesn't fit in to the menu of scientific naturalism, so they have to reject it. I'm just like, you can't, you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater if you're doing that. It's like, who's saying, it just sounds like such a preposterous idea. It's just like, there is no self. Well, who's saying that? I am. Who are you? You're myself. Okay. All right. We're just sort of going in circles then. It's sort of like that dialogue that went back and forth between was it Dan Dennett and Galen Strawson. And I can't remember what it was. Was it the New York Review, or I can't remember what it was, but they exchanged letters back and forth in this thing. It's like Dan Dennett was saying the consciousness doesn't really exist, and Galen Strawson called it the silliest view ever put forward. Just like, of course it exists. Like, there is. He's the guy you were talking about earlier on. Actually, you talked about real naturalism. It's like, yes, there is naturalism, but it has to be real naturalism. Like I'm thinking now, we're having conscious experiences. Everybody has conscious experiences. If you want to be a real naturalist, fine, but you have to include consciousness and subjectivity. And I think like that idea is starting to sort of catch on now. Like you had that book last year or 2 years ago by Evan Thompson, was it Marco Gleiser and Adam Frank, I think are the three co-authors. What's it called? The Blind Spot of Science. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Where they talk about, I think I referenced like the original article that they wrote in the book, which they make it fairly obvious. Like, yes, science can explain all these things except for this one thing, which is fairly important, which is, experience. Because you can't do any of that without this. So, like, it's, I don't know, the whole thing just seems a bit silly in retrospect.
How would you think about it if in an alternative universe everything was the same, but then people weren't able to report the experience? Like, would that change your view?
Okay, forminess isn't something that's added to experience. It's a necessary structural part of experience. There's no experience without forminess. If you can't report something, like you're either in a coma or you're asleep, but if you're having this like amazing psychedelic experience, then it has to exemplify forminess because that's part of experiencing. It's not because I think that's the issue that I think some of these neuroskeptics have. So they think forminess is just something that's added in. It's like the secret spice or something. Well, it's not. It's part of it.
But then the way that you describe it now, it seems to me that you're almost making it very close to the bare experience in the most fundamental possible, as if it's qualia or qualia, however it's pronounced. But then there's also a sense of forminess, unless I maybe misunderstood your schema a little bit, which is like I'm experiencing, but I'm like it's there's a me that's experiencing it, not in the sense that that the reference point can be completely destroyed, because again then you don't have the experience, but you can at least lack the awareness of happening to you particularly. Like it's kind of funny to me, because to me that this actually when I think about this, that I think the notion of raw experience, to me this is actually the closest that you can get to it. Like to me this is the case where it does make the strongest sense rather than like a perceptual object. So it's, to me it's more like what is being attached to, like the reference point, that is what disappears in some way somehow. But so yeah, help me clarify a little bit. Like, is it just pure qualia, or is there something else that's kind of like a reference?
Yeah. What do you mean by something else?
The way that I'm thinking, I mean, I'm doing this on the spot. I haven't thought about this very well before this. It's just like when you were speaking, it kind of popped into mind. But the most natural way of thinking about it that it comes to me is that it's almost like an identity thing, which is like there's a happening, and like what is that happening in reference to? Like that is what I take it to be, the most straightforward understanding of happening to me.
Hope I get her name correct and I pronounce it correctly. I think it's Marie Guillot. She's a really good paper. She talks about subjectivity, and like we use that word like really loosely, and she breaks it down into three different parts. So there's meanness, there's mindness, and there's forminess. And I argue in the book that meanness is the sense of yourself that's given to yourself in an intentional act. And then mindness is the sort of link between the forminess, which is just the bare bones, pre-reflective, just experience coming in. So mindness links those two, and meanness is your sense of self that you have, that like this experience is mine. So I argue that meanness and mindness, they can dissolve as well. But forminess is an intrinsic part of not just perception, but experience. And that you're not having experience without forminess.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that helps clarify a little bit. It's just very tricky to have all these terms in mind, because they're so similar. Okay. Now, a very large aspect of your book is this reference to the ground of being, where you then seem to kind of conceptualized a little bit as this ultimate reality that you can get in touch with on the psychedelic experience, and that's very much related to the rawness of experience before all these conceptual division. Now, obviously, we've talked about a lot of these things already, but one way that I would like your take on something a bit more specifically is that obviously this ground of being is a very rich term historically and culturally and theologically. And coming back to what we were talking previously about this notion of kind of following the logos and kind of this love has being kind of this force in the universe that you can align yourself with. One of the issues that I'm wondering is like how do you put these two things together? Because the ground of being when you describe it has simply this reduction of the ego, and you get more in touch with the object, let's say in a more raw form of experience. You can make that case without any values whatsoever, I think, and I think some forms of Buddhism actually can do this, and it seems a relatively rational argument, but that is very different, at least from the West, of how we talk about the ground of being. Now, to some degree, and this is a bit tricky because to some degree, the ground of being is also a term that then got associated with a more impersonal view of God, let's say, that is not so childish. But at the same time, there's a rich tradition of, okay, but this ground of being also can't be this like completely valueless, impersonal thing. So I'm just wondering, like, how much value in the sense of values, in the sense of love, do you put in this ground of being? And then how do you connect that to the fact that it seems that your notion of ultimate reality is very dependent on simply being prior to the conceptual division of perception?
All the easy questions today. Eh? Well, okay, as a realist phenomenologist, part of the package deal is that you're a moral realist. So, good and bad morality or values are in the cosmos, and we intuit them. So there's no separation between, is it Ingarden uses the term like valueception, or no, it's Shaler, I think, maybe, that you perceive values, not perception, with the mind's eye, or with your gut maybe as well, because that's kind of where you feel it. I mean, the ground of being is, again, like I was saying with language a while ago, is a tricky one because you're trying to put a word on something or a term on something that sort of steps beyond into ineffability in that case. Yes, I've lost my train of thought now. Can you rephrase the question again?
Yeah, no worries. Also, my question was a bit convoluted, so that doesn't help. But what I was trying to, the way that I tried to frame it is that you put a lot of emphasis on this ground of being, but also this is also very related to the notion of ultimate reality being defined as preconceptual kind of experience. But then there's also this perspective of like, okay, love is the highest expression, and there's kind of this logos that you're trying to follow, like, but like one is very value rich and almost a bit more personal like to some degree, and one of them you can think of it as completely valueless and with zero personality whatsoever, even though that's a horrible word.
Yeah, well, I can't. Well, I can, but I think it's incorrect to conceive of the world as valueless. Like you're saying, like I think you have to be a moral realist, otherwise you end up tying yourself in weird knots when it comes to things like retributive justice or free will, like because everything in philosophy is interconnected. You know, you can't have your cake and eat it too in a lot of different in a lot of different cases. So I'd reject the idea that the world is valueless or lacks personality. And as for ultimate reality, like I don't. Yeah, so we're talking about the ground of being. I don't think because it comes across as this weird esoteric sort of ethereal, hard to grasp notion, but for me, it's not. It's not that. I think it's the Gospel of Thomas. Christ says the kingdom of God will not come by expectation. It is spread upon the earth already, and men do not see it. I think that's a nice way of thinking about not just the psychedelic experience, but just experience in general. The kingdom of heaven, or the ground of being, isn't somewhere else. It's not this metaphysical realm that you have to try to tap into. It's not here in your afterlife. It's here already. Like, it's like, yeah, the ground of being isn't an idea that you get in a philosophy hall or an idea that you get sitting in a meadow on mushrooms. It's here right now. It's in this conversation. It's in my dog's whining at the door. It's, everything everywhere all at once. Yeah, similar to, yeah, it's like the Tao. It's just, it is what it is. Again, I should have brought a bell with me. I could just rung it every now and then, just to, as a sort of, as a reminder. It's like, that's what it is. Like, every time we talk about it, you're sort of, putting things aside. But if you can, drop the ego, because that's where the cleavage comes in. It's like, we can't, because like I said earlier, you can't be dabbling in the ground of being at all times, because you wouldn't get anything done. My kids would be very hungry. Somebody will nag you and tell you to come back, and it's like, okay, that's right, you come back, but it's there. I think that's where the healing effects of psychedelics come in as well. It's like they show you that, like, oh, this is what's there, okay, and then you can come back and you can, that it's there. Then it like your ordo amors has been shifted, or your existential orientation has changed. Then you've got a better understanding of who you are and what reality is.
Awesome. Yeah, I really like that. I think that's really good. And I think that's precisely what I tried to emphasize as well, because again, I was doing this little bit of a critique of kind of the field, which is very self-focused. And I think one of the reasons why I think that's so detrimental is because it really leaves no place to exactly what you just said. Because like if it's just your own self being reduced, I think it allows you, either it's not a factor at all, or at least it's a de-emphasized factor. The fact that you're reaching for something that it's either real, or at least most people consider it the most real thing they ever encountered. So you still have to take it seriously nevertheless. And I think that's the best way to conceptualize the psychedelic experience. And I think that's why this focus on the self is just not, it's just not rich enough. I think the notion that I use a lot in my own work is the sacred. It's like you get in touch with the sacred, and that allows transformation. It allows existential orientation and whatnot. And so if you always think about, oh, it's just your brain, kind of reducing some models of the self, like there's still a lot of value on that, but it's just not the most useful framework in my mind. So I really liked how you've put it here. Now, in the book, you talk about this notion of noetic conviction, the fact that you're absolutely convinced that there was some kind of knowledge that you have gained during the experience, and that you're apprehending reality as such, or the deepest level of reality, and we have to take that seriously to some degree. And I think for you this is especially relevant when you then when you apply that to the ground of being, which is kind of like how you kind of make your foundation. Now, I'm just curious about how you approach this notion of noetic conviction when you start expanding outwards of the type of claims that are being made. Because the ground of being, well, first of all, that's already very tricky, as we've seen, but at least in the most basic, like impersonal sense, I think that's something that a lot of people, I think, could get behind. Like maybe they wouldn't use it themselves, but they would be like, okay, sure, fine, that's kind of reasonable. I get where you're coming from, right? So a lot of people could agree with that. And then you say, okay, but there's this notion, there's this feeling of absolute certainty when you get in touch with the ground of being. Now the question is, when you get outside of that and the claims get more and more specific, more and more precise and more propositional, a lot of the times the feeling of this noetic conviction is still there, either very strong or also like like that's often how people often describe it as well. It's not like I have high conviction. I have the highest conviction, humanly possible, right? And so if you have that in these other claims that keep like expanding, then you start having a problem, right? Because they're harder to justify in like a philosophical rational sense, and also you start getting this problem that, okay, but they're not always coherent, like either across experiences of the same person, or across people, or across cultures. So how do you figure out this kind of relationship and level of trust that you can have on the noetic conviction of the psychedelic experience.
All right, so I start talking about the noetic quality first in the book in reference to, I know that there's a tension because so many people have had psychedelic experiences and they come back and they say that felt more real than real. That's the noetic quality. And the noetic quality comes from William James and his varieties of religious experience, one of the four marks of the mystical experience. So it's been noted as something that's relevant to mystical experiences, not just psychedelic experience, but mystical experiences just in general, and has been described as in mystical experiences for centuries. So in reference to psychedelics, I know that there was the tension between people say that these are hallucinations, but how can it be a hallucination if people describe it as being more real than real? So then I go through my approach to perception and ego-free seeing, and I say that, well, when the ego is put on hold, what you're actually perceiving in the external world is the things just as they are. You're beholding the essence of the vase of flowers, to return to that example. And then in relation to the experiences you have on your mythopoetic journey that you're on, because I end up making arguing for the position of what I call psychedelic realism, which is that the idea that psychedelics can reveal mind-independent features of reality. So in the mythopoetic sense, I use the example of having an encounter with Odin hanging on, Yggdrasil for 9 days. Odin is just the symbol, which is in the flesh of the essence of, the quest for knowledge, for example, or it's the essence of striving, for example, maybe. So, I don't think it's wrong to say that I think that all of the psychedelic experience is veridical or perceptual or true or non-hallucinatory, but the most important elements of it reveal or put one in direct contact with essences without the veil of ego getting in the way, or being pragmatic about what's been given to you in that moment. So I think the noetic quality, you can refer or defer to intersubjective corroboration for a large part. Like if it was one or two people who had these experiences and were like, that felt really real, then you can kind of say, oh, yes, you're just on drugs. But when it's so many people over such a long period of time, then you have to take the claim a bit more seriously. You'll never be able to satisfy the, natural or scientific naturalist, because that's the worldview that they're in. And like I said earlier, I'm never going to tell anyone what they should think, but the data is what it is. There's many people who've had this experience. It has this feeling.
Now, I'm going to derail this a little bit because something interesting popped into mind when you were describing the vase again, like the goddamn vase always chasing me. So when you mention in the psychedelic experience, you're looking at the very essence of the object, like as precisely and as technically as you can. What exactly does that mean? Because when I think about essences, I think very much in like standard Platonic terms, which is, the fact, for example, that I have a bottle in front of me that I've been drinking some water. There's something that is the bottleness of the bottle. Now, and that allows, and that this is also part of what I meant of the fact that perception is already laden with meaning and you can't get around it. The reason why I think Platonism is so strong is precisely the fact that I can't. There's no bottle, and there's no perception of bottle outside all this entire context of what a bottle means. It's just absolutely impossible. Now, the reason why this is confusing me a little bit on your view about the essence, and for example, the vase of flowers, is because you do seem to have, you do seem to attribute some weight to the mystical and existential import of the experience. And I number one, I don't quite get why in this context, at least right now when I'm thinking in these terms. And also, precisely because of this, like, already embedded sense making, like, maybe the vase of flowers isn't the best example, but it's probably good enough, which is like, even in a psychedelic experience, someone in Europe looking at that vase of flowers, looking at the essence of the vase, that wouldn't be the same of someone in Japan. How do you make sense of this? And like, how would you define this notion of looking at the essence of the vase of flowers? Like, what exactly does that mean?
I don't agree that someone in Japan and somebody like me looking at a vase of flowers are going to have two different experiences while on, well, not just necessarily psychedelics, but even, if we were meditating, for example, I think we'd have very similar experiences. I think because like I talk about perennial philosophy quite a bit, which I think is more of a unitive approach to philosophy because like the idea is that we're all humans. No one's got more skin in the game than anyone else. Like, people from if you're from Brazil or South Africa or Australia or Japan or Europe or wherever, like we all have the same physiological and cognitive capacities for the most part. So I don't think like culturally, like maybe my perception of the flowers in ordinary states of consciousness would be different to someone in Japan. But like you could say the same, like if someone's a flower arranger here, could have a different perception of the vase of flowers to someone who's a, garbage man in Japan. And again, like essence, yeah. So for to get onto the essences part, then I don't think they're like yeah. Remember, it's sober Platonism. Where you don't need to posit some sort of impersonal other perfect realm of forms that you're somehow sort of participating in. Just you're recognizing just the thing as it is, its own essence that it has. The essence of flowerness or the essence of beauty, which is being exemplified by the flowers, for example. But you don't need to posit something else.
The way that I think about it, I do think, and maybe I'm missing something, but I think the problem that I'm trying to articulate doesn't depend on there being something else of like the forms existing elsewhere. I think the problem that I'm trying to highlight is more that the abstraction is inherent in the object. And by saying that you're looking at the essence, like necessarily you're getting more in touch with the abstraction, right? Or no?
Well, how do you mean by the abstraction?
By the vaseness of the vase.
Not necessarily, because at a certain point as well, there's the it's unitive as well. So you're not like recognizing. I guess when you're looking at a vase, there's still something out there, and there's something you're still aware that there's a subject-object differentiation, but you're also becoming more aware of the metaphysical continuity of everything that there is. That it's all just one thing happening all at once. It's not like those flowers are completely different objects to me. It's like those flowers are participating in being, and I'm participating in being, and here we are participating in being together because this is being.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, at a certain point, it sort of, you end up in paradox because you have to, because it's like I was saying about language earlier on. It's the best thing that we have, but it'll only get you so far. I think Dietrich von Hildebrand is something like that as well in terms of like philosophy. At a certain point, philosophy can only bring you to an edge, and then you have to go into religion after that because there's a precipice after which words and logic and everything they don't apply.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, still trying to stick with philosophy despite those limitations. Essentialism to me is actually quite important because, again, I am trying to have a very Platonic view, and it's just I think super helpful, and then also that allows me to bring many other mystical traditions as well. And obviously it's very important for you as well because of everything that we have discussed. But it is very, very, very unpopular in philosophy. And I think some of the arguments are actually pretty good. Like it's been a while since I kind of read them, but at least at the time I remember thinking, I still think this framework is useful, but I understand the objections, and I'm not exactly sure to solve them. So, if you met, a philosopher in a conference, whatever, and you told her, your basic thesis, and she'd be like, oh, but that relies on this, essentialist view, and that can't possibly work because of A, B, C, D. Like, what would you say? How would you defend essentialism from the typical objections?
If you read Plato and he starts talking about math, like, he's taking out the big hammer to defeat his interlocutor. It's like, you can't do, like, you have to be a Platonist about math. It's philosophy, so everybody will have, an argument against everything, but like, it's incredibly tricky to not be a Platonist about, mathematical objects and mathematical truths. Um, which sort of that just cracks open the door just a little bit for essences, because you have to admit that. You have to admit the laws of logic. And you said it's unpopular. I mean, great. That'll fine. That's fine with me. Positions don't need to be popular to be true. It's not my job to tell people what to think. I'll give my opinion, and like, I'm not going to try to convince. I tell students as well. It's like, don't believe a word I say. You should question everything I say and think for yourself, and make up your own mind. If someone wants to think that there are no essences, sure, that's fine. They're just going to have a more impoverished worldview. Because I think there's good arguments, like I said, with the mathematical objects, like, because then you're forcing yourself to reduce things like love we were talking about earlier on, or beauty, just down to just physical objects and just, yeah, physiological happenings, essentially. And even art as well gets reduced to just, can you explain like one of Beethoven's symphonies just in physical terms? So you can't really, there's vibrations, and then there's a gap, and then there's more vibrations, and then there's a gap. But it produces this reaction, this emotional reaction, a sort of visceral, sort of like, oh my God, you're moved by a piece of music. It's like, that is no evolutionary benefit whatsoever to whatever's happening. Like, if you're going to be, like, why aren't we just behavioralist entities? Why do we have things like emotions and consciousness itself? Why do we? That's not beneficial evolutionarily. That it burns so much energy having these sort of conversations. It's like, yeah, I wouldn't try to convince anyone. I just, yeah, pretty much say what I said to you. It's just, okay, well, then you got to get rid of, love and beauty and art. And we just think of art as like a painting on your wall that, makes you feel really happy, is just, patches of color. If you think color exists, if you want to go that far and be a, fictionalist about color at the same time. But that's a different conversation, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. Now, at some points, you mention in the book that some people kind of accuse mystical interpretations of psychedelics, or even mystical experiences in general, of having a Christian bias. And then the way you respond to that is that, well, yeah, sure, but it's kind of like it's the context of where we are, and there's always an interpretation problem and whatnot. And I agree with your whole take, but something that I find kind of interesting is that even though I like your response, I actually find the original claim very odd, because to me it's actually the exact opposite. Like, from my perspective, I think that the field has an overwhelmingly like bias towards Buddhism and Hinduist ideas, and like this goes all the way back to the 60s, but it still seems very prevalent, kind of in philosophy today. And I also think this then is what's driving a lot of this focus on the self as well, is precisely because that's the problem that seems the most relevant to people. And again, if you go to more Eastern traditions, that is the problem, and it's not the case in the West, right? So like, to me, that kind of feels a little bit backward. So yeah, I would like to ask you, what do you think of kind of like the influence of different traditions, let's say Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and also of biases more broadly? Like, what do you think are the biggest biases in the field?
Scientific naturalism. That's that's the biggest set of blinkers, I think. I think that's why I tried to adopt the perennialist approach, because like, I don't think any one particular tradition has got everything correct, but they're all sort of hinting at the same, objective truth that we that we participate in, that we're grounded in. Yeah, the biggest biases are, and the for Western scientific approach, it's that, scientific naturalism, as we've spoken about a few times already, um, that puts a very strict metaphysical boundary or border on your explanation of the experience itself, which is, I don't know, it's like, because when I was looking at it first, it's like, okay, you're trying to explain the psychedelic experience, but your field of knowledge can't explain experience. So how can you, like, what do you can't get to the thing itself. You can't explain experience qua experience. You can explain it as, reduce it down to, oh, it's stuff happening in the brain, or it's stuff happening in, you know, socially, or stuff happening, psychotherapeutically, but there's a very strict border happening there. I think that's the biggest bias. And as for like religious approaches, you got to start stripping away particular traditional conceptualizations, and let's look at the ideas themselves. Like, what is unity? What is love? Rather than this is the Vedanta approach to whatever. This is the Zen understanding, or and just take the perennialist route. I think that's the safest option. Not like, yeah, there's always going to be some bias one way or another, depending on where you are, but you can be aware of it and do the best you can with the concepts that are there and not restrict yourself.
Now, on this issue of restriction and traditions, like perennialism is something that I'm very fond of. Like I have a lot of respect, and I think it gets a lot of things right. But I also think that there's quite a big limitation of it, which is like you're just, by trying to focus on the overlap. First of all, you're kind of focusing on the overlap, which I think is already a little bit tricky. But also, even if there is such an overlap, then you kind of have to discard everything that wasn't present in that overlap, and then you have to answer like why you're justified in doing that, and I think that's quite tricky. And so and I think this is easier in your case because, I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying, so feel free to correct me, but in the way that I perceive a little bit of how you framed your thesis is that to some degree it is a little bit of a metaphysical proposition of just like this ground of being that is real, that is present, and metaphysical in like an ontological sense, like not in the sense that it's something funky going on. And so because you get in touch with that, then that is spirituality, that is the deepest level of reality, and you can find bits and pieces all over the traditions, right? And so that's kind of like your whole schema. Now, where I'm coming from, even though I appreciate that, to me, it's not the most truthful, or it doesn't feel the most true to me. First of all, because I don't put so much weight into that like single thing, like experience of like, oh, this is the ground of being that you're experiencing, and kind of what's driving a lot of this is kind of this quieting down of the ego, and then you get more in contact with reality as such. But again, coming back to how I was trying to describe it earlier, I do think that it's more of an existential orientation that you have in the world, and I think that allows you to get in contact with reality. But it is a very, very, very complex reality that, to me, focusing on simply like a subject-object distinction or something like that, I think that's like a very, very, very small portion of it. Like I think that, for example, the way that I'm relating to you, the way I'm relating to my fiance, the way I'm relating to my mother, that is an explosion of possibilities. And the types of life frameworks that I have in order to decide which one it is, those are very complex things. And I think kind of like this very like metaphysical, like peak experience of the ground of being, to me, that actually doesn't help me at all. And I think this is precisely where the traditions themselves are very helpful, and almost precisely in the non-overlap that they have with each other, which is like, this is the map for your life. Now, you might think some maps are better than others. That's fine. Like it's very hard epistemologically to decide which one is the best, but at least you can make a commitment to it of what you think is the best map, even though this sounds a bit silly and kind of like too subjective, but it's still the best thing that you're gonna get. And so the reason why I think this is a bit problematic for me when I think about perennialism is, okay, if this notion of ultimate reality is based on this like very rich maps that you have, some maps are going to be better than others, and to me that is the definition of being in the highest contact of reality, and that means being true. And if one is true, then by definition also that kind of like crumbles perennialism. Now, I can't say which one is true. Like, I can have intuitions myself, but I can't tell you. But despite that lack of knowledge, there's still like an ontological distinction. So that's how I personally kind of came to view it after some years. So I'm just curious how you view my perspective as someone advocating perennialism.
Okay, interesting. You know, I get what you're saying about like how different religious maps have different, like they'll order your life. For example, like in Christianity, you have, there was the 7 sacraments. So, your baptism, your communion, confirmation, marriage. I can't remember the others. Yeah, it helps society to order the stages of their life accordingly. Maybe I misspoke in my last answer, or like wasn't clear. Like, I'm not saying that we should abandon religion or religious terminology entirely, but just in like future explanations, not just base or future research into psychedelic experience, not just ground them in one tradition or another, but just look at the concepts themselves. So the concepts, like the concept of love and justice and truth and beauty, those are found in all the different religions, and they're like explained in a different way, but the concept that they're discussing doesn't change. Like, for example, you have the was it the Dalai Lama? I think it was the Dalai Lama who said like he's not trying to convert anyone. It's like you read, Tibetan Buddhist texts and get something from them, but you don't need to become a Tibetan Buddhist. You can remain a Taoist or a Christian or Muslim or whatever the case may be. And I think I'd say the same. Like, religion does help to order your life. Like, I never have time, but I like the idea of going to church on a Sunday, just to have a dedicated amount of time per week, just to go and sit and just be in being, well, depending on the church, I guess, and the priest. But you're asking, yeah, if you find out if one is true, it's true. Like, what do you mean by true? To a degree, I guess all the major religions, to a point, have to think, well, this is the right one, and everyone else is wrong. And then you end up with things like the Crusades, or extremism or fundamentalism. But that's religion neutered, I think, because then you're taking away the metaphysical aspects of it, and it's just a sociological power play at that point. Because then you're dabbling in politics, I think. If you keep the metaphysical aspect of religion, where it's like, okay, this is you, and this is the cosmos, and here's how it all relates together, and here's what values are, and here's how you order your life, then I don't think any one of them is 100% true or accurate, or I don't know if they could be, because again, I come back to the issue of the insufficiency of language. Like, it's all like there's very little difference between Zen Satori and the cloud of unknowing, for example. It's interculturally, I don't think there's more similar, because you were talking about the similarities and the differences. You don't need to discount all the differences and just look at where the overlap is. What was it? Dana Sawyer, he had a good book called Perennial Philosophy Reloaded, I think came out a couple of years ago. And he defends perennialism from precisely that attack. That, well, you're only looking at, where everything is the same and similar, and you're discounting everything else. You're saying, no, you don't need to discount everything else. You can just look at the core of what's happening and just say, there's love and truth and beauty and all these things, and they all share the same things. Everything else can be explained through, context or culture. But at the core, there's more convergence than there is divergence.
Oh man, this is so complicated. I have like 10 different things in my brain, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to approach it. But I would say, first of all, in relationship to like negative consequences of an anti-pluralist stance, first of all, I would just discard that right away, because that's more like a political action and the political interpretation of the philosophical debate that we're having. So I think that should be discounted right away. And then I also don't think that it's a sociological thing at all, because because again, and the reason why I think you can have this stance is precisely because of all the importance of phenomenology that we talked in the beginning, and why I think it's so important to see, like, okay, sure, there is a sociological element, but that's not where I'm coming from. Where I'm coming from is that, you're experiencing life, and like you need to act, and you need to know how to act, and you need to have a system of some kind. It doesn't mean a religious system, but like you have to have a framework of how you think about yourself, how you think about the world, and how you go about doing things. And so it's a very real embodied thing. It's not this like abstract, sociological thing. Now, the issue is, okay, there's unity within traditions, like for example, love, beauty, and truth. Okay, sure. But then again, this comes back to like that. I think we need to be a bit more holistic and context aware when you talk about these things. It's like those things aren't just like isolated abstractions that just magically like align your life, right? So it's like, for example, I value beauty, you value beauty, but we're going about it in different ways, right? So like it's not the same, and therefore, even if this is our highest values, even if this is like the core of our ontology, then the way that we pursue it is different. Now, then because what you say, and what I think a lot of people in Perennialism say is kind of like, okay, that's what matters. Okay, sure. But then how you pursue it and how you embody it then depends on these like smaller details. So for example, when I talked about that, one of my key insights was precisely, okay, I need to base my ontology on what I'm unwilling to compromise, and for me that's love. Then to me, an immediately follow-up like framework that I was forced to choose is like, okay, if that's the most real, then what allows me to embody love the most, that is the most real. And that's necessarily going to depend on the cultural tradition that you're practicing. Like, I think there's no way around it. Like, because again, these things very much depend on the kind of framework that you have, the kind of rituals that you have, the kind of language that you use. Now, again, epistemologically, I'm okay saying there's no way to tell, right? I can't convince me of what I think is the highest, most, efficient, that's such a horrible word, of getting in touch with ultimate love. But in order to, but for you to say, or for the British position to say, oh, they're all equally good, like, to me, that just sounds almost impossible, like almost by definition.
Obviously that they're all equally good. We're talking about religious traditions now, for example, is it?
Yeah, I shifted a little bit towards kind of like a broader context of like religious pluralism and exclusivism and whatnot, but I wasn't super clear when I kind of jumped a little bit. Sorry.
Yeah, because I wouldn't say that they're all equally good or that they all do exactly the same thing, because necessarily when there's human beings involved, like we're flawed, everybody makes mistakes, nobody's perfect. I think they all have the same intention of getting to the same participation with reality, or same understanding of reality, or trying to. But then that's not to say that they're necessarily all good. Religion has done a lot of bad things, has done a lot of good things. Again, like I said, it's because people are involved, and we don't intuit essences perfectly at all times, because that's just not possible.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
Because we're using words to talk about very difficult, weird concepts. So
Yeah. Of course.
again, I should have brought a bell with me. I keep thinking, like that's my answer to everything. Ding. There you go.
Yeah. Amazing. But no, but this was quite helpful. I also heard you, I think on a different podcast, where you were talking about that you're working on kind of the semiotics of this space of therapy itself, and obviously you also mentioned in the very beginning that you're kind of like training to become a therapist. So I'm very curious to hear about exactly the type of work that you're trying to do, and what's the overall thesis.
Well, yeah, that's something I'm very curious about as well. That's it's still a work in progress. I have some outlines done, but it's still like it's a couple of years away from, maybe 2 years away from being anywhere near complete.
This is a safe space. You can say it, even if it's not very clear.
Psychotherapy is one of those weird things that's it's sort of mutton dressed as lamb, I think, if you get that phrase. In that it's pretending to be a science, but it's not really yet, because they use so many terms and concepts very loosely without correctly defining them. So I think psychotherapy in general, not just psychedelic psychotherapy, but psychotherapy in general needs some conceptual refinement. Not to say that it should be discarded, but it just, okay, well, what do you mean by empathy? What do you mean by authenticity precisely? And what are you grounding this in metaphysically then? Like, what's your approach? And are psychotherapists cognizant of what what their metaphysical grounding is? What do they think reality is? What do you think is at play when you're, not tinkering, but helping another person realize their full potential? What's going on there? Because right now there's very little grounding. There's a lot of like good work being done, but coming into psychotherapy from philosophy, I'm just like, when nobody's defining the core concepts in any sort of satisfactory manner. And then, when you add psychedelics to the mix, then it gets even more complex and convoluted, epistemically, metaphysically, psychotherapeutically as well. What's going on in the relationship, what's going on within the group. And then again, in terms of semiotics, like what's going on in the space that the therapy is taking place in. And all of these are just giant question marks at present. Like people have, a few ideas like, okay, a hospital room may not be the best, friendliest environment to have a psychedelic experience, but it's what you're stuck with at the moment. How can we make that better? How can we understand it better? So yeah, these are all the questions that I'm sort of like trying to get in order at the moment and see if somebody will give me money to do some research, but we'll see.
Got it. Yeah, super interesting. I'm looking forward to reading that.
Yeah, me too.
And besides this element that we just spoke of, is there anything about philosophy of psychedelics that you think is quite important and meaningful, but that you weren't able to cover in the book for whatever reason?
Yes. Yes is the short answer. Actually, what you were saying is quite interesting about the existential orientations. I'm looking forward to reading your work, actually. Yeah, I've got a couple of papers on the go. One just look at dissolution of the self and inspiration, the idea of inspiration and authorship. What else am I looking at? Oh, I'm trying to demythologize psychedelia as well through the lens of Barth, and just to take psychedelics as they are, because there's so much sort of lumped on top of them at the moment. It's just you can't. It's a minefield. Like when you talk about psychedelics, people have all these preconceived notions, and I'm trying to sort of get rid of those a little bit. So that, yeah, people just, I don't know. People just need to relax, just let things be what they are. That people, like, it's either too serious. There's a lot of psychedelic conferences and stuff that I see happening, and just I look at the lineup and what's going on there, and there's too much. How can I phrase this? There's too much woo, if you if you know what I mean. There's too many crystals and too much silliness, which I want to sort of just naturalize it again in the Platonic sense, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Wonderful. It's the middle way, the middle path.
Exactly. Yeah. Walk the tightrope.
Exactly. Okay. Amazing. I'm very on board with that as well, and I think this is a good place to end it. We've been at it for quite a long time. I really appreciate the time that you dedicated to this. Very appreciative of your work as well. Going to show the book here one more time in case people want to check it out. It's wonderful. And yeah, thanks a lot for the conversation. It was amazing.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tiago.
All right. Cheers. Bye.